In this story, Locke was a beast tamer who teamed up with his friends, but their party had only lasted 3 years when Isaac, the swordsman, suggested that they get rid of Locke because they were an S-rank party and Locke was useless. Emmy, the mage, was against it, but because a hero was joining their party who'd guide them into a famous dungeon, she was shut up. Even Locke knew he was nothing better than an errand boy at the party because he had yet to meet a single magical beast. Later, the hero, Kid, joined their party and treated Locke as a servant with his fake dragon sword from Temu. In the dungeon, Locke was at the forefront, burdened with everyone's bags but still getting bullied by his supposed friends. He used a skill called Monster Radar, which permitted him to estimate the number of monsters and their locations in the dungeon. Isaac impatiently told Locke to walk faster and lead them to the boss, but he said he couldn't because he could run into hordes of monsters. When Kid laid his hands upon the map, he revealed that Locke hadn't been leading them on the shortest route to the boss. His teammates got mad and yelled at him for making them take detours, and Emmy spanked his cheeks. Eventually, he took them down the shorter route and they arrived at the boss monster's gate. Locke suggested a break, but that only got him fired, effective after the current quest. In the boss's chamber, they found a gray wolf, but upon closer inspection, Locke found it was Fenrir, which was more dangerous than the gray wolf. The idiots, still assuming it was a cheap gray wolf, pounced upon the beast before Locke could warn them not to wake it up, and it turned into a chaotic race for their lives. Locke was at the forefront, but the hero dragged and stabbed him in the chest, and everyone left him for dead. Eventually, Locke's bad luck caught up with him, and the Fenrir was positioned right behind him, ready to gobble him up. But before then, the beast gave a TED talk about how Locke's teammates were cruel for sacrificing him and how he'd make his death painless. Locke stopped him when he realized the beast could speak the human language, and the beast paused after learning that they could communicate with each other. Somehow, Locke convinced this wild creature to play catch instead of eating him up, but the beast shared that it was trapped in the dungeon by a strong barrier. So Locke proposed that if he got the Fenrir out, they would go on adventures together. A strange voice in Locke's head said the Fenrir wanted to be his friend, so he befriended it, meeting all the conditions to acquire a mini monster garden and transform his familiars into friendlier forms. Locke named the Fenrir Lucky and earned a treasure chest as his reward for defeating the boss. Inside, he found a red dog collar and a bracelet that the system equipped as a mini monster garden bracelet, allowing Locke to enter or leave as he wished. Locke was clueless about the garden in his bracelet until Lucky transported himself into it and reappeared immediately. Locke did the same and found himself in the mini monster garden, standing in front of a house. He planned to gather other monsters like Lucky, who wanted to escape their barriers, so they headed into the dungeon to escape the boss floor and arrived at the dungeon's barrier. Lucky returned to the mini monster garden while Locke walked in through the barrier and out of the dungeon, and then Lucky got out again, thanking Locke for rescuing him from the dungeon. As they rode in town, the city guards perceived Lucky as a threat and were all dying for his meat, even after Locke said the beast was his familiar. The cute guild receptionist, Rika, congratulated him on taming his first beast, and he narrated his ordeal in the dungeon. Rika shared that Kid was rumored to have used his previous party members as decoys for the Fenrir on multiple occasions. She told Locke that his party upgraded to S rank mostly because of him, and that his friends would be punished for violating the rules. However, when Locke heard that they still hadn't returned, he dashed out to save them because he knew Kid could end them too. Lucky warned him against helping them because they'd betray him again, but Locke said that was the last time he'd help them. Meanwhile, Kid called his party members dimwits because the shorter path they took led them to hordes of increasingly strong monsters. They went on a break, and Kid found that all their weapons were worthless, so he called them morons and said that they only became an S-rank party in a short time because of Locke's divine protection, which protected their weapons from damage and boosted their abilities. Kid also said they were only as strong as C-ranked adventurers, but Isaac outrightly dismissed that. Kid deceived Kara into exhausting her powers, stabbed her, and left her for dead as a decoy. Isaac and Emmy were unaware because they were running for their lives, while Kara was left to die. Isaac was furious when he found out, but Kid said she had to be sacrificed for the greater good. They battled the insects with no progress until Locke arrived with Lucky, trampling on the monsters. Isaac was shocked to see him alive, while Lucky suggested that Locke have his revenge. Emmy begged him to save Kara, so he dashed to her aid but found her unconscious. He poured a recovery potion into her mouth and she woke up, apologizing for abandoning him to die. On the way out, Locke's attention was drawn to an entrance leading to the nest of the monster ants, where he found some eggs alive amid broken shells. The eggs hatched and he was ready to slice them off, but the ants thought he was their daddy who had brought some sugar. The system informed him that the orange ants wanted to befriend him, and after befriending them, they transformed into cute little Gen Z baddies, whom Locke transferred to the mini monster garden. The system permitted him to upgrade his mini monster garden since he had now befriended 6 new monsters. He improved the river, the pond, the hut, the fruit tree, and the space of the monster garden. The orange ant got to work, sorting out the materials from the monsters he had defeated, and the girl with the tiara said she wanted to be his baby. Later, when they had returned to the guild, he found Kid and Isaac denying the allegations against them, and when they saw him, Kid was literally begging Locke to lie and explain what happened in the dungeon. Locke exposed him, saying he had claimed to be an S rank and yet could not even clear the 4th floor. Not to mention that he stabbed and used Kara as bait and had stabbed Locke earlier that day. Isaac was aggressive towards him, but Kid said Locke was only lying because he got fired from an S-rank party, because there was no evidence of all his claims. In fact, Kid reminded him that since he was a hero, he could simply report Locke's false accusations to the king and make his life a living hell. But just then, Locke dragged out the hero's broken sword and pressed it against the stab crack in his armor, showing it was a perfect match. The loser claimed Locke had stabbed himself until Kara woke up and accused Kid of attempting to murder her. By now, the other adventurers believed the allegations against the so-called hero, and the guild receptionist stated that the very least of his punishments would be to strip him of the hero title. Anyway, Locke turned to leave, but Isaac fell on his knees, begging like the filthy dog he was, and offering Locke unlimited back shots if only he'd beg the guild on his behalf. However, Locke reminded Isaac that he had been aware of Kid's plan to get rid of him and still did nothing, which meant he had been trying to get rid of him all along. Immediately, Isaac was pissed, saying he had been good to Locke and had upgraded him to S rank, but the guild receptionist told him that it was only because of Locke that he was in an S-rank party. And as a matter of fact, Locke was the only one with S-rank level ability, while the rest were at the very best B-ranked. Isaac found it hard to believe this and said that both of them should fight, and if Locke won, he would accept any demotion, but if Isaac won, then the guild would drop the allegations against him. The guild receptionist asked Locke to team up with an E-rank adventurer and prove his training abilities, while the other 3 party members, except for Kid, would team up against Locke, because Kid was already a suspected murderer from years ago. The dude thought that there was no such evidence that could survive so many years, until some guy in the hoodie narrated that Kid had also used one of his friends as bait and led to their death, but no one believed him at the time because of Kid's powerful connections. The moment Kid realized that he had been discovered, he went on a slaughter spree and attacked the villagers one after the other, listening to no one, and eventually holding Emmy as his hostage. He told everyone to get out of his way if they didn't want her to die, and then he took off with the girl. Immediately, he was knocked out by Lucky and successfully restrained by the villagers in his unconscious state. When Kid was captured, Emmy apologized to Locke while Isaac was pissed, but said that he would be merciful enough to put Locke back in the party. However, Locke said he was no longer going to be in their party, and Isaac was furious, so Kara told him that they had betrayed Locke after all, and he would team up with her instead. However, Locke reminded her that he could not part with someone like her who also abandoned him, and they got into a petty fight that Emmy had to stop. She told them that Luke had been helping them the most, especially in the dungeon that they had just explored, and all of them were responsible for what had happened. Anyway, the guild receptionist told them the challenge would still be on, and the difficulty would range from C to B rank level of difficulty. Isaac told her to stop underestimating them with low-level tasks because they could never lose, but when Locke saw the list of things they were to get within a week, He asked Isaac whether he was comfortable with the contest. Isaac went on blood burning until he also saw the list, because it would involve them meeting every single one of the phobias, such as insects and green frogs. In simple terms, the guild was silently warning them not to mess with them, but someone as stupid as Isaac insisted on performing the task regardless. The guild receptionist took Isaac on a walk to meet the E-class adventurer, and on the way, she told him that his new party member might not be a rebel or traitor, but she would require Locke to discipline her with his unholy rod. The girl she was talking about was a cute elf baddie named Shannon, wearing a slave collar because she was an adventurer taken in by the guild. It turns out that all 5 of Shannon's previous masters died from suspicious deaths and accidents, but they were all explainable causes that had nothing to do with her. The girl had, by herself, considered herself the Grim Reaper and said she was refusing the request, but Locke went on being the good guy and nearly paid for it with his head. He narrowly dodged the attack, and she called him a weakling, saying he could not even afford to stay close to her. Locke went on with his rambles, but she cheerfully asked him if he was that desperate to die, and said that she was now a slave because she had given up on life and was sick of seeing people die. Seeing her cry broke Locke, so he said that if all she wanted was for him to prove that he was stronger than her, so she could agree to the request, then he would prove it to her. He picked up a bamboo stick and they began sparring right away. Even though she was pretty fast, Locke managed to disarm her and told her they were done discussing whether she'd follow him or not. However, she sprang up from the ground and displayed her excellent martial arts skills, but Locke dragged her by the arm and flipped her onto the ground. She eventually acknowledged defeat, warning him to get ready to die soon, but Locke told her that he wouldn't die that easily. This statement triggered her because all her previous masters had said the same thing but still ended up dying, and for that reason, she had absolutely no reason to lose to Locke. Locke wasn't going to have her pass so easily either, so he decided to show her the reason why he was not going to die. He summoned Lucky, who immediately transformed into his pet form, and then the monster ants, who transformed into their humanoid forms. At least, this caught her attention, and she was obviously amazed, wondering who on earth he was to have a Fenrir as his familiar. Here is a quick backstory on Shannon's life. She had a younger brother named Seth with whom she was raised in the peaceful home of the elves, but one day, Seth went missing in the Forest of Affection. Shannon was told to stay home and take care of the house while their parents went to look for her brother, but she just couldn't sit still and went searching for him on her own. When she didn't find him in the forest, she visited the mage's house, because mages and elves once swore friendship in the Forest of Affection, but there was a forest belonging to a mage that was off-limits. She got in and found the huge mansion, dark and empty, and eventually found her younger brother lying on an altar. She checked his pulse and breathing and found that they were diminishing, but just then, she saw a giant eye floating above them. The whole thing was like a Hollywood horror story, because immediately after sighting that eye, the doors shut, and when she tried opening them, they were locked. The eye asked which one of them should be saved, and Shannon immediately said it should save Seth, so immediately after making that choice, something took possession of her body, and she didn't remember what happened afterwards. She woke up unconscious in their house and saw her brother, smiling, almost as if the previous day's events never occurred, making her wonder if it was all a dream. However, she noticed that the creatures around her began to die, and one after the other, the creatures that died in her presence grew bigger and bigger in size, until her family's horse died at last. She tried explaining everything to her parents, but no one took her seriously, and in a bid to protect her family, she quietly left the village without telling anyone. However, she ended up as a slave but met her very first master, who was kind and gentle and taught her about the world. But 6 months later, the old man died in his sleep. Her second master died of an illness after 3 months, the third one died after falling off a cliff, the fourth one poisoned herself, and the fifth one was eaten up by a monster. It soon became clear that anyone who came in contact with Shannon would die, and she earned the title of the Grim Reaper for that reason. She soon got fed up and was luckily taken in by the guild, but she hoped she would end up in prison so she wouldn't have to be involved with anyone. However, the guild receptionist invited her to join them as an E-rank adventurer. She preferred being alone and explained what happened so that they would turn their backs on her, and she used various means, such as brute force, to push them away. This was how her life went until the very day she met Locke, who, instead of going away, took her rather seriously and refused to hear her out. After seeing Locke's familiars, Shannon felt confident and shared that she had only been suppressing her true feelings all this while and still desired to live a happy life. Something about Locke made her feel she could rely on him, but right after making her mind up, she passed out and had to be taken in by the guild receptionist. Afterward, Locke befriended a bird that had passed out due to fear of the Fenrir and then transported it to the mini garden. Later, Shannon regained consciousness and apologized for her behavior earlier on, saying she might not be experienced, but she would surely give him the best ride of his life. Locke sealed their partnership with a fist bump, and Lucky did the same. But the wolf soon felt something off and said he could tell from just touching her that she had a powerful curse on her, which drained the life force from those around it and would eventually take her life as well. Unfortunately, the wolf himself could not break it, but he felt Locke could break the curse. Immediately, he showed Locke a glimpse of heaven when he placed the boy's head in between his jaws, but it turned out he was only transferring knowledge into Locke's head, and after giving Locke his slimy, dripping head, the guy realized that what Shannon was cursed with was the opposite of divine protection. Just then, some guy claiming to be the guilty chief told Locke that he could not permit him to break the curse. Locke was angry, wondering why the guy won't let him break the curse, so the guild chief Titus explained that Shannon belonged to them, and according to the rules, amateurs had no right to go about spell-breaking their stuff. Locke was angry but was warned to get a hold of his emotions. He eventually figured out that he could get rid of the curse on her if she was no longer their staff. So the guy told him in summary that he would have to buy Shannon from their guild if he wanted to help her. Locke was speechless, but Titus explained that he only wanted his adventurers to be happy, and Shannon was no different, because after a difficult life, she was still a sweet and caring person. Titus felt Locke and Shannon were both similar in that regard and could be good partners to each other, so he hoped they would both watch each other. Locke was touched because he never knew that anyone cared about him all this time, and here the guild was, worrying about him. Shannon eventually agreed to team up with him, and now all that was left was to pay the fee for her freedom. The receptionist said the fee would be the same amount as the reward for the request, so now all that was left was for him to find the way to break the curse so they could go on their quest. He chanted some spells and the giant evil eye came out of her, but was soon fastened around Locke's hand and tried to consume his body. However, Locke remained persistent with his spells, and eventually the evil eye was vanquished. Titus explained that the curse originated from a Magian, who was rumored to have ruled the world with his summoning magic. Shannon was grateful to Locke for helping her, and he transported her to his mini monster garden where they would rest and prepare for their journey. They were hungry, and Locke had hoped that the orange ants would serve them some meat. It turns out the ant girls were busy building a dungeon. Shannon realized that she could perfectly understand the orange ants, but failed to comprehend what Locke and Lucky were discussing. So the ant girl explained that she had the skills to negotiate with other races and command them, due to her leadership role, and that she was the only ant who had that skill. She made a copy of the skill and transferred it to Shannon, who immediately understood Lucky and thanked the ant girl. Locke named the leader Ant Girl Patra, and then named the rest of the ant girls a bunch of dumb alphabets that they were rather excited about. In the underground dungeon they made, they had a cold room for meat, a drying room for fur, and some demon rocks. Locke was surprised that they achieved all of this within a short time and had to return to Earth because they had no cookware to cook with. He went looking for some food ingredients when Isaac showed up, asking for trouble. Isaac asked Locke to kneel down and beg so he would let him join their party once again, but Shannon quickly stepped in between them and asked him what he was after. Isaac immediately moved to punch Shannon's face, but Locke caught him quickly, blocking the punch and fixing his gaze on him. Isaac referred to Locke as a piece of garbage, but Shannon told him he was in need of a shrink because Locke was not an object. Kara asked whether Shannon was really Locke's new partner and then mocked her, saying she had pretty lame clothes and should at least order some from Shane. But Locke told her he wished she could order some sense from Shane, just the way she ordered her dresses. Emmy, being the only sensible one, apologized to Shannon for what her teammates said and then bowed, apologizing for all they had done to him. She also said she was surprised that he hadn't quit being an adventurer, and that the contest was an opportunity for her to gauge her power against him. Both parties went their separate ways, and Locke told Shannon that they couldn't afford to lose. When they returned to the mini-garden, Locke prepared a nice meal for everyone but Shannon, and the ant girls gobbled down his protein because they were tasting the forbidden fruit for the first time in their lives. He then shared his plan with them, explaining how they could arrive at the new dungeon where their items would be found, and after eating, they set out. With a monster as fearsome as Lucky, none of the other monsters dared to attack them, but suddenly they heard a crying voice, almost as though someone was getting attacked by a monster. They later found that it was a gargoyle, but the deceitful animal soon attacked them with wind magic, although it was immediately countered when Lucky created a spell that almost destroyed the kingdom's capital. Unfortunately, Lucky could not stop it, so Locke immediately tried to create a spell to cancel it, and then concentrated the spell onto a single point with a prism. Eventually, he let the excess magic flow into the forest, causing a Y-shaped junction, and when everything was over, he took a recovery potion to heal an injury on his arm. Lucky felt bad, but Locke told him he was trying to help, but encouraged him to learn how to control his powers because his magic power was disaster class. For now, they had to deal with the stupid gargoyle that started it all. Locke asked the gargoyle why it was crying in such an abandoned place, so the monster said he was fired from the Demon Lord's army because he was weak and was only useful as a cleaner for the past 100 years. However, the army leaders found no use for cleaners and fired him, and just as he arrived at a certain village nearby, he was attacked. He was crying because he had just experienced his first encounter with humans, but it turned out he was hated there, and now he wondered what he was born for. Locke asked him what his plan was, and the gargoyle apparently had no life plans. So Locke invited him to join them, and when he had befriended the guy, he transferred him to the Sacred Beast Garden. Now that he had more sacred beasts, he was allowed to expand the guarding, so he chose to expand the cabin. Also, he found it weird when he noticed that there were cabbages in the forest, in the middle of nowhere, until they walked deep into the woods and found a village. There was an old guy sleeping at the gate's entrance who thought of Shannon as an angel and moved to kiss her, but he was given a proper welcome by the wild dog. He thought Locke and his party were bandits, but when he found out that they were adventurers, he directed them to the village chief to seek advice. Locke noticed that there were lots of skinny people in the village, despite the fact that there was no story of a farm in that region. He introduced himself to the village chief, Onagami, who told him a story about the village. About a year ago, their village was raided by goblins who took whatever little food was left and then took the lives of some of the villagers. They asked for his help because they had made requests to the state and guild, but couldn't afford the fee required for a request. But Locke felt it wouldn't be smart for him as an adventurer to be helping people with free requests. Not to mention the fact that he could save them this once and they will still ask for free help again. So he asked for a map of the area and for directions to where the goblins were. He informed them about the cabbage patch he found on the way to the village, and then said that he would help the village, but they should, in turn, give him 20% of the revenue in the future. When that amount seemed impossible, then he asked for 10% instead, and the villagers started murmuring amongst themselves. The village was not all that great, because it blocked traffic from the rest of the city, had poorly maintained fields, and had no special products or anything good to their own name, so it was almost impossible to help them for free because they won't stand on their own. The village chief went to consult the rest of the villagers and came back, saying their opinions were divided, but they knew they couldn't do anything for themselves without external help. They offered contingencies as compensation instead, and Locke offered that if they wished to cooperate with him, he would deal with the goblins and take care of their food provision. Well, some of the older men almost agreed, saying there won't be a better deal than that. A middle-aged guy said it wasn't such a good idea and was rather suspicious. He said he would have dealt with the goblins by himself had he not been injured in the process, but Locke generously offered him a healing potion. The idiot rejected it, thinking it was suspicious, so Locke had Shannon and Lucky try it out in front of him, both of whom said the drink was very refreshing and delicious compared to other typical bitter potions. The older guy, Warren, eventually agreed to have some, even though he thought they were lying. He immediately experienced the same heavenly feeling as the other two and said it was refreshing. Also, the drink tasted like something that could cure his 1-minute syndrome, and almost immediately, he said, the body pain was gone and movement in his legs had returned. Locke instructed him to help out by treating the other's injuries by sharing the healing potion, and he gladly agreed to do so, after which he introduced himself as the village chief's assistant, who would be willing to cooperate with them. Eventually, all the villages agreed, and it was 6 days until the guild's request deadline. Later, they threw in a large feast, and the villagers had plenty to eat, and Locke told everyone that he would be helping with the construction of a road, which might help the villagers solve their problems with foreign currency and food supply. Next, he cast magic to support them and get things moving faster, and then construction work began. They had made so much progress by the end of the day, and Locke said they would probably be done with the work in a day's time. Later that night in the mini garden, Locke was up all night, making more plans for their construction work. But Shannon couldn't go to sleep because, in her own words, going to sleep before the master was wrong. Locke told her not to call him her master, but Zaddy instead. She eventually fell asleep, and so did everyone else, except Lucky, with whom Locke went out that night, catching rainbow dragonflies. They ate them up, and the next morning, Gargoyle borrowed Barbie's dress to prepare breakfast for everyone. Later that day, they sent cabbages and rainbow dragonfly wings to the guild, using the very road. They are constructed that morning. To solve the food problem, Locke taught them how to catch rainbow dragonflies, cultivate the fields, and plant cabbages. When the road was completely constructed, that night the villagers were happy, and the ant girls were thanked for their contribution. The village head was very grateful and suddenly realized that 10% of the profits was a small fee to pay for all that Locke had achieved in the village in only 2 days. Afterwards, they all split up to collect the items required for the guild's conquest, namely orengo eggs, green frogs, and fresh emeralds. They could not reach the labyrinth, so they decided to wrap everything up the next day. Meanwhile, Isaac's party arrived quickly, but it seemed they were up to no good. The next morning, Locke learned that his bird had transformed into a cute chick, and he also noticed that Lucky stunk like a skunk. He told the wolf to get a shower, and when it refused to do so, Locke caused the rest of them to gang up against him and bathe him against his wishes. Since Lucky decided he won't comply, Locke cast support magic on everyone but him to boost their strength and speed. In no time, Lucky was surrounded by ant girls who spewed some threads from their mouths and tied him down. But the victory was short-lived because he tied them up with their threads. The gargoyle offered to challenge him next, but after flexing his waist and hips, he lost successfully and was easily slapped out by Lucky's tail. Next door, it was Shannon's turn, and she had sparred with Lucky with so much speed and accuracy that she eventually held him at knife point. However, Lucky had already pointed his tail at her neck, so she knew she had lost already and surrendered. The only person who hadn't fought with Lucky now was Locke himself, but just before they began fighting, Lucky fell asleep, all thanks to a sleeping flower that the bird held. The same day, near the dungeon where the quest was to be carried out, Isaac was losing his cool, wondering why they hadn't arrived at their destination yet, and hating on Locke for no reason at all. Emmy reminded him that they were the ones who betrayed Locke first. Isaac told her to shut up because he felt he deserved to win and couldn't accept that they were, at best, C-rank adventurers without Locke. The ladies spoke up about how they couldn't touch the orengo eggs or rainbow dragonflies, so Isaac told them not to worry, because they didn't have to collect everything for the request, since wyverns were the main goal. Kara asked him why he was so full of himself because he occasionally accepted requests without confirming the details or discussing them with them, and she confessed that she and Emmy were only helping him because they had no choice, and in fact, they were going to leave the party after the request. In exchange, Isaac said he would be the one giving them orders while on the request. When they hopped out of the cart, Isaac paid the rider some chips, but the man said it wasn't enough because he had gotten them closer to the dungeon than he usually would take people. Isaac had no option but to slam more coins in his hands, and the man took off. It was 4 days until the request date was due, and they were already at the dungeon while everyone else in Locke's camp was busy petting Lucky. Now in the dungeon, Isaac told his teammates that they were only looking for wyverns deep inside the dungeon, and perhaps collecting the other items on their way back if there was time. However, they found no rainbow, dragonflies, or green frogs, and Isaac felt like the guild was setting them up by placing a request without knowing the current situation. Just then, a goblin came up from behind him and attacked him, but he sliced it in half, only to find that one goblin was the least of his problems and that he was going to face the goblin knight. He sparred with the goblin knight, but could barely keep it going because their swords clashed, and he didn't have the strength to continue. It was then that the guild receptionist's words played in his head, but he refused to accept that he was just a C-ranked adventurer. However, he kept losing stamina with each push from the goblin knight, and would have died if not for the immediate intervention of his other teammates, who activated a fire spear and got rid of the goblin. Instead of thanking them, he simply said he would have easily defeated the goblin by himself, but now they were all surrounded by goblins and how to get rid of them. Eventually, they were done with the goblins, and Isaac said the goblin knight was the boss, so it was okay and they could focus on defeating the wyverns and returning to the guild. They arrived at the wyverns' camp, and Isaac planned to draw the attention of the wyvern, while the girls would use magic to pierce their wings, making it easy enough for him to finish them off on the ground. There were 2 wyverns further away from the group, so they started off with them, and just as planned, the girls got rid of their wings with magic and Isaac finished them off. But surprisingly, it turned out that there was one more wyvern which sprang up from behind, hit them, and caused them to fall to the ground. Kara was upset, warning Isaac to be more watchful and looking out for them on the sidelines, because Locke was always protecting them when he was in their group. However, Isaac got angry at the mention of Locke's name and told Kara that even though she was just an escort, she should be able to protect herself. Kara got angry and dragged Emmy's hands, saying they would surely die if they stayed with the fool. He pleaded with them, but they ran off, with Kara even suggesting that they switch to Locke's side. This pissed him off, and he was tired of hearing everyone compare him to Locke, so he decided that if he wouldn't win the quest, then neither would Locke. Just as some wyverns were about to eat him, he activated a skill named Grand Cross, which caused a massive explosion in the dungeon and was so huge that it could be seen in the sky. Locke immediately knew that it was Isaac and the others, so he went to the dungeon together and only saw everywhere covered in smoke. Thereafter, Isaac and the others were seen coming out of the cave, and Isaac said he had destroyed all the materials and turned them to dust, so they won't be able to complete the quest. However, Locke simply smiled, saying he never imagined that Isaac would do such a thing, so Shannon advised that they return to the royal capital, buy the materials, and then deliver them to the guild. Locke, instead, suggested that they check for some more wyverns, and Isaac cockily told him to go ahead and investigate, but all he knew was that they would be heading back first. Later, Locke and the others found the goblin knight and the other goblins who had died, meaning the village was now safe. Even though Isaac had destroyed lots of the wyvern scales and all that with his fire, Lucky found wyvern eggs that were hidden behind the rocks and remained unharmed. They transported it to the mini garden and later informed the villagers that the goblins were now defeated. Shannon suggested that they take care of some more goblins at a certain swamp, and after they spend one more day, they have completely built a fortress surrounding the village to protect them from monster attacks. The village head and the others thanked Locke for helping them out and promised to implement all that he had taught them. Now, their next stop was the royal capital. At the royal capital, Warren was a cabbage vendor who seemed to be cashing out and handed Locke his share as he promised. Later, Locke headed back to the guild, where Isaac welcomed him with a smug expression on his face, saying they were late. Isaac's group had already submitted the materials required for the competition, and Isaac assumed Locke went empty-handed. After the guild receptionist inspected the materials Isaac's team submitted, Isaac instructed Locke to get on his knees and bend over because he was pretty sure they would win. But he was disappointed to find that Locke had already submitted his items some days ago, and they were even more in number than what Isaac's team had submitted. Isaac was livid, saying that Locke had played dirty tricks on them, but Locke said there was nothing of that sort, because in fact, Isaac's team did not source the materials by themselves, but rather bought them from a store, and there was even a village mark on the items. In fact, Locke already knew that it would fail to get the required items and had deliberately told Shannon to suggest buying the materials outside of town. What Isaac didn't know was that Locke had already gotten the materials needed, and it was some of his own stock that they sold to Isaac's team at a high price. This further enraged Isaac, who wondered how Locke reached the dungeon earlier than he did, so he told them that on the map, there was a faster but more dangerous route leading to the dungeon. To worsen matters, Kara confessed that she knew about the shorter path, but said nothing about it because there was no point in passing through a dangerous forest. Isaac was mad at her and asked whether she wasn't as eager as he was to defeat Locke, but she asked him to look around again so he would realize that he was the only one who wanted to win. Anyway, Locke thanked Isaac for helping them to defeat the goblins, because it helped those poor villagers who couldn't afford to pay the guild to do it for them. When Isaac was angry enough, he dashed forward to attack Locke, but the guild chief Titus stopped him right there and added that Kid confessed to colluding with Isaac to get rid of Locke. Isaac was later interrogated with the other team members, but the girls only got a downgrade to rank C, meaning their S-ranked party was dismissed. The ladies wanted to team up with Locke again, but he politely declined the offer, so they formed the party between themselves, while Kid was sentenced to prison and was still being investigated for his past crimes. For Isaac, he was punished to work in a mine for half a year, and if he ever wanted to be an adventurer, he would have to start from rank E. Locke wasn't so glad because those were his childhood friends, so he felt he would find it more difficult to get along with his family since he failed to get along with his friends. However, he vowed to use his power for the sake of his friends and to believe in them. Life was beautiful and whatnot, but Locke didn't know something more sinister lay ahead for him in the future. Days later, the royal capital was attacked by ogres, and lots of adventurers were either injured or dead. When all hope was lost, Locke rode in with Lucky, who had to deal with the ogres while getting support from Emmy and the rest of his familiars. With all of them combined, dealing with the authors was not a problem, especially for Lucky. Shannon and Patra were also doing well together, so the only disappointment in the group was Gargoyle Kun, whose pathetic magic, Wind Bullet, couldn't even get rid of a fly. This was because the gargoyle's power was still sealed, and he couldn't unseal it by himself. Locke and the others helped him, and eventually, the ogre menace was taken care of completely. However, Locke couldn't understand why even a single ogre would show up in the royal capital, not to speak of about 10 of them. As Kara helped the injured recover with her healing magic, the Imperial Knights finally rode in, led by the captain, Marcus. He said they would investigate the cause of the ogre rampage by taking the cops, but this annoyed the villagers, especially Titus, who asked why Marcus and his guys were trying to steal monsters they didn't even defeat. The guy kept acting nonchalant and saying he was going to pay a miserable compensation after all, but Titus got angry because the knights showed up after the adventurers had risked their lives, so it was only fair that they got compensated accordingly. The guild receptionist intervened and said she would take over the conversation, while Titus returned to the others, explaining that the adventurers would soon leave the country if such oppression continued. If this happened, the country's citizens would become more endangered and the country's economy would decline. That aside, Titus had a quest for Locke. It revolved around a case of stolen magic stones called combustible stones, and since there were no eyewitnesses to the crime, investigations were rather slow. He then entrusted this investigation to Locke's hands and said he would be paid even if he didn't manage to catch the thief. Later, Locke went to see a blacksmith to get suitable equipment for his lowlies, but Patra was interested in learning magic while he was stopped. Some dude came through the entrance and kicked her out of the way, saying monsters shouldn't be hanging around their space and calling Locke a mere beast tamer. The idiot went about bragging, but Locke ignored him to check on Patra, who was unconscious. However, the girl sprang back to life, saying she was okay and that the dude was a weakling. The guy was disgusted when he found they were ignoring him, and when he noticed no one gave him any attention, he made a scene, saying his name was Missile. He was born in a high-class family, and he was also likely to become the next leader of the Knights. He then warned Locke, saying it would be best for him not to pick a fight with someone with such high standing. But Locke couldn't care less about his threats and immediately asked the guy to apologize to Patra. Missile turned his attention to Shannon and made a racist comment about her being an elf, so she asked him to repeat himself one more time, and he even went on to call her an old hag this time around. However, she was mostly pissed because he insulted Locke and told him to get ready to be taught a lesson. But just then, Marcus showed up behind him, and in the next scene, the guy was apologizing with his expired buttocks cheeks. Marcus apologized for Missile's unruly behavior, and Locke forgave the dude. Apparently, Missile was also sent to investigate the stolen combustible stones, and since he didn't do it, Marcus asked the blacksmith about it. The blacksmith didn't give much useful information, so Marcus asked Locke to share any useful information he had regarding the case. As he returned, Shannon said something about the guy being a good guy, but after hearing what Titus had to say about Marcus, Locke knew better than to assume he was a good person. Afterward, Locke inspected the location where all the combustible stones were from and noted that there were 2 entrances into the building, so the thief could enter the storeroom without the owner noticing. The question was why the thief would take the trouble only to steal 1 combustible stone, and even if it was to sell the stone off to make money, then it would have been more profitable to steal the more expensive weapons in the room. In that case, all Locke needed to know was the thief's objective for stealing those stones. The blacksmith showed Locke that there was a particular chest, which was tightly locked, and none of the stones in the chest had been stolen before. Locke still wondered what to do next, so he sought permission to summon his familiar, Lucky, for assistance. When Lucky came, Locke asked him whether he could help to track the thief down by his scent, but Lucky told him that there were way too many scents in the room, and it was hard for him to pinpoint a particular scent. Lucky returned to the mini-garden, and the blacksmith said he was impressed that Locke had now grown to master his craft of beast taming. He offered Patra a breastplate as a gift, but Locke said he couldn't possibly accept such a priceless gift, because it was only made from a material only used by the noble elite and the royal family. Apparently, it was a noble family who requested him to make the breastplate for their child, but the child felt sick and could no longer use the breastplate. Eventually, he convinced Locke to have it, and the next day in the mini-monster garden, the ant girls went hunting with their new weapons, fighting wild boars until they got tired and fell fast asleep. Later that day, the wyverns hatched, and Locke befriended them, so he earned an upgrade of 3 facilities within that dimension. He chose to include hot springs, a mine, and a banana tree. Later, he headed out to the guild with Lucky and Shannon, but on the way, they observed something ominous arising from a graveyard. Lucky excitedly ran to check it out, thinking it was a ghost, but the ball of fire they had seen disappeared. Shannon looked uneasy, saying she wasn't that great with ghosts, but Locke told her that he and Lucky were there to protect her, and if she wanted to rest, she could always wait inside the mini-garden. There was a grave belonging to the great sage Domort, who was rumored to be a woman who contributed greatly toward the country's development. She was a typical 10 out of 10 who had visited the Demon Lord's castle alone and made the demons sign a ceasefire agreement. The others were impressed, but Locke said the story was just a legend, and no one would ever know if she was such a great person as Roma had said. As the sun began to set, they returned to the guild and found Missile complaining about his quest. The moment the guy spotted Luck, he handed over the quest to him, saying he should accept the quest on his behalf. Apparently, a number of used compostable stones were found in the sewers, so the guild was looking for someone to go clean and investigate the sewers with a reward of 30 gold coins. Locke was speechless, because the reward was quite small and that idiot was asking him to accept the job, but Missile said he should consider it an honor because he had received this from a noble. In the same vein, Missile insulted the receptionist, calling her an ugly and useless woman. Well, by the time she switched up from a princess to Chucky in one heartbeat, Dude respected himself and walked out of the guild. On the other hand, Locke had no choice but to accept the job about the sewers, so he went to the stinky location and found some of the combustible stones they had spoken about. He and Shannon split ways, but he warned her to be careful because the floor was slippery. However, Shannon tried to impress him by showing just how wide her legs could spread above the ground, but she accidentally slipped, and Locke fortunately caught her in his arms. The girl almost passed out from embarrassment because their faces were so close, and then she probably realized that she had a crush on him. To heighten her embarrassment, Locke invited her to enter the hot springs with him so they could make some hot offspring. The next day, Locke noticed that the baby wyverns already knew how to fly, thanks to the gargoyle teaching them how, so he offered Locke and Shannon a flight on his back. The couple enjoyed and took in the beauty of the city from the sky. So Locke thanked the gargoyle for helping create a wonderful night for them, although he wished he had a familiar that could fly while carrying Lucky around. Gargoyle said he knew the perfect monster for that, and it was none other than the griffin, who just happened to be his best friend. Later that night, they headed to the hot springs, and some plots were really plotting that night. Shannon's body looked like a slice of heaven, so obviously it took a lot of self-restraint from Locke's end. For some reason, Lucky was also in the water, and it was funny that he was because he didn't like bats at all. He said he just wanted to enjoy the hot spring and thanked Locke for bringing him out of the Dungeon of Flames, and they had fun for the rest of the night. The next day, Patra tried on her breastplate, and Locke found that the blacksmith had created more for the other ant girls. To show his appreciation, Locke handed the man a bag of coins, but the blacksmith refused it until Locke somehow convinced him to take it. The man took it to a special place, but he suddenly informed Locke that the combustible stones had been stolen that very moment. Locke summoned Lucky to follow the thieves' scent, while the blacksmith noticed the window open and said he saw some blue light leaving the window. Lucky sniffed the person's scent and around town following the scent of the person, but it surprisingly led them back to the ominous gravestone they had seen earlier. Lucky said the scent got cut off on the back of the tomb, but on inspection, nothing looked suspicious. Just then, the birdie flew in with the flower of exorcism, and that somehow led to the opening of an underground stairway, and a very bright light shone upon them. Seeing the staircase made them realize that the tombstone was shrouded in illusion magic, but the problem was that even if they wanted to enter, the opening was too narrow for Lucky to enter. Locke decided to enter alone and only call on Lucky if he was in trouble. Locke observed that the space underneath the grave was wide and dark, but his thoughts were interrupted when an undead suddenly appeared and said he must be a pretty high-ranked magic user for him to find the hidden space. Locke asked the undead who she was, and she gave him the "it's obvious" look, because she was Saint Domort. Locke prepared his weapon as he realized that he was facing a monster, but a fairy appeared out of the blue and warned him against hurting the lady while threatening to burn him to the ground. Domort told the fairy Lala to shut her little mouth up and the girl to calm down, after which she asked Locke the purpose of his accidental visit. Locke explained that there had been repeated incidences of stolen combustible stones, and the thief's scent brought him to the gravestone. Immediately, Lala gave herself away as the suspect, apologizing while explaining that the combustible stones were needed to keep Domort alive. Donnie confirmed this to him and went down a spiral of thoughts, remembering when she was just a wasted lady having dinner with the demon lord, whom she had forced to OD on her piss until he could no longer. It was actually a bet that if she won, he would put an end to the war, and since she did win, it was time for him to fulfill his promise. However, the demon lord said it wasn't like the demons themselves wanted to start a war in the first place, because humans cut down all the trees in the hills and fields, leaving insufficient food for the monsters. It was for this reason that the demon lord wanted to take some of the land back, because demons had no idea how to grow their own food. Domort offered to teach them how to grow their food if they would agree to stop the war, and it seemed the deal was sealed, because food was abundant, making the monsters satisfied. When the war came to an end, Domort took in an apprentice named Lydia, who was kind-hearted and lovely. Lydia wasn't talented with magic, but had top-tier communication skills that made people trust her, a trait even Domort admired about her. One time, Donnie went into research about a hidden treasure belonging to the undead, and Lydia suggested that if we could create the ones and make them work, making them produce food semi-permanently, the amount of manpower would be reduced. Somehow, this conversation annoyed Donnie because she said she would no longer continue her research with the undead, and that the research must never be completed at any cost. Even in theory, such possibilities should only be exploited for military purposes because they could cause the balance of power in the world to be significantly upset. Lydia argued and brought out her evil side, saying the world was at peace, and nobody gave a hoot whether there was a food shortage problem. Instead, they should focus on research that would shock the world, and Lydia wanted research that would carve her name in history. Dalmort tried reasoning with Lydia, but eventually, the girl disappeared with Dalmort's research papers on the undead. Dalmort spent the rest of her life searching for Lydia, but failed to find her, and when she died, she thought the search for Lydia and her research papers was over, but years after her death, her magic mixed with the magic in the soil, and she became an undead. As an undead, she possessed a significant amount of magic that permitted her to cast illusion magic on the entrance of her gravestone. Again, she began to research the undead by using herself as a test subject, and if Lydia was ever able to complete her research on the undead, Donnie was interested in creating a countermeasure to prevent the devastating long-term effects. However, her body could not keep up because she had no magic supply or magical stones, but one day, when she had given up on surviving, Lala came by and was surprised to see a talking skeleton. Dalmort playfully teased Lala about one of her wings, and Lala shared her insecurities and episodes of being bullied because of the wing. However, Dalmort gave her a pep talk about self-esteem, and they befriended each other from that day. One day, Lala learned that Dalmort was going to die a second time, so she went back to bring a magic stone, and it became a habit. For this reason, now in the present, Dalmort asked that she should be punished instead of Lala, because everything Lala was doing was all for her sake. Both ladies went back and forth arguing to prevent the other from being punished, until Dalmort said Lala shouldn't put her life on the line for her. Lala broke down crying because Dalmort was the first friend she ever made, and Locke could understand why they were both acting that way, and it was because crimes related to magic usually resulted in the death penalty. However, he saw how honest Dalmort was because she didn't even attempt to attack him and run away but rather atoned for her crimes, not to mention that Lala was also a sweet person. Locke wanted to help them, but they had to first admit to stealing from the shop and from the Knight's Order. However, the girls were quite confused because even though they did steal from the blacksmith shop, they didn't know anything about the Knight Order. In fact, Lala had only brought one combustible stone back. This only meant that there was another thief, but before Locke had a chance to put his thoughts together, there was a loud explosion on the surface, and they all found out that the kingdom was on fire. Locke returned hastily to the kingdom, but Dalmort insisted on following him. In the capital, insane numbers of zombies attacked the citizens and were barely kept at bay. Unfortunately, they did not die after being hit, no matter what was done to them. Rika tried to hold the fort since there were very few adventurers, so she was glad when she saw Locke with the others. She explained that all of a sudden, the large number of monsters that were secured away by the Knight's Order suddenly turned into undead and started going wild. Even more so, the zombies could only be stopped by using holy magic, and there were very few adventurers who could provide that. To worsen the situation, ever since the Knights began hoarding the dead bodies of monsters, lots of adventurers moved to other countries, so now the guild was trying to source help from the adventurers in other countries, but it would take a while before they arrived. Rika would personally handle the journey to other guilds, so she left, leaving the care of the zombies in Luck's hands. The moment Dalmort saw this, she was confident that the power in these zombies was derived from her research papers, and the culprit must be Lydia. Lydia used the combustible stones as a source to power the undead, and was able to complete the undead research for that reason. Inevitably, she was the culprit behind the theft of the combustible stones. For now, the zombies had to be taken care of, so Locke commanded his familiars in the mini-garden to step outside, except for the wyvern. He told them they would be subjugating the zombies while protecting the people in the city, but suddenly, some zombie orcs arrived right behind them. However, Dalmort got rid of them by casting the Castle of Hellfire on them, and then she volunteered to help them. Before she could help them, though, she asked for magic stones because she had used up so much magic already. So the ant girls offered her some, and she saw that they were high-quality magic stones. She said she had the power to involve the entire kingdom in a holy barrier and eradicate the undead. Locke was speechless, so he told her he would help her buy some time since she asked for some time to chant the spell. They got into action, but Locke noticed, rather oddly, that the undead were vanishing instead of coming back to life as they usually would, and also that Shannon and the other adventurers couldn't beat them. It was then he realized that only familiars were capable of defeating them. Immediately, He instructed Shannon to tell the other adventurers to gather their familiars so they would help fight the monsters. Using that method, a significant number of zombies were gotten rid of when the knights suddenly arrived. The adventurers were disgusted and annoyed at the knights, but that was when Locke noticed an ominous look in Marcus's eyes, and the next thing they knew, arrows were flying towards them. Fortunately, Lucky quickly protected everyone with the fur that he had hardened. Locke challenged Marcus, reminding him that they were allies. It was then that he realized that Marcus's eyes were red and menacing, and he commanded the rest of his army to attack the adventurers. Locke commanded his familiar to just knock the knights out for now, so Gargoyle used his wind magic to blow them away. However, they realized that the knights were now acting like zombies, and even Missile was acting similarly and almost stabbed Locke from behind. Patra took him down and he came back to his senses, wondering why the atmosphere was a little weird. At least, that helped Locke to discover that knocking the knights out with magic didn't work, and they might regain their consciousness if struck with blunt force. Locke informed Missile about what had happened, including the current brainwashed state of the knights, advising Missile to evacuate with the civilians. However, Missile proclaimed himself as a proud knight and said he was going nowhere, because his duty was to protect the people and fight for them. The idiot rushed head-on into the groups of monsters, but he accidentally messed with the wrong guys, the ogres. However, he got slapped out of existence and then crushed into the ground with an earth-quaking punch. It was horrifying to watch, but surprisingly, Patra had blocked the attack on Missile's behalf and told him a weakling like himself should just run away. Locke quickly ran to fetch his little girl because even as an A-rank monster, 2 punches from an ogre would be way too much for her. He ran to her like his life depended on it, but right before his eyes, the ogre formed a fist with both hands and struck the ground mercilessly. For a moment, time stopped and everybody was frozen in shock. While Locke had already started the morning with his first daughter, just as he was crying like his ex had just dumped him, Lucky told him to pull himself together, because a wyvern had picked Patra up in the nick of time and she was safe. To Luck, it was rather surprising that the wyverns that were born only a few days ago were already so big, but then again, the dragons were on steroids. Anyway, Locke gave her a recovery potion to drink, and the effect kicked in immediately, so she resumed commanding the other ants. They all hopped on the wyverns, but in that brief moment of distraction, Locke sensed someone coming from behind at the last minute and escaped. He fortunately was not stabbed to death by Marcus, who told him not to get in the way, because the knights planned to get rid of all adventurers and Titus in particular. The guys started clashing swords, and it was obvious Marcus had the upper hand, because it took nothing for him to kick Locke into the wall. Locke asked Marco to return to his senses, but Marco said he was perfectly sane, and the adventurers were the weirdos because they all foolishly obeyed Titus, who was just the chief of the Adventurers Guild. However, Marco boasted that he himself was being acknowledged by the king of their kingdom, and that made him superior to Titus. He then said if Locke was going to get in his way, he would just get rid of him already, but he didn't prepare for Lucky's sudden intervention, who didn't even bat an eyelid and slapped the guy away with his tail. In no time, Marcus revealed that he was Lydia, and Lydia said she was going to inherit the will of her master, Domort. The plan was just as Domort said, to complete the research on the treasure of the undead and become popular, and that she would sacrifice the country to achieve that goal, even if every citizen was dead. But Locke reminded Lydia that it was Donnie's research after all, and also rightly told her that she was the thief of the combustible stones. Lydia didn't even deny it and said she found a way to control Marcus and stole the stones using his body. So the idiot was busy looking for the culprit when he was the one all along. In any case, she immediately commanded her knights to get rid of everyone and disappeared cluelessly, not noticing that nothing she said had worked. When she was gone, Shannon asked where Lydia's real body would be, but that was when Domort suddenly showed up, getting ready to destroy as she had promised. However, she found out that she was too late to the party, but they asked her if she knew where they could find Lydia. Surprisingly, she led them to a watchtower outside the city. Locke headed towards what he thought was the entrance, but Domort showed him the entrance to an underground stairway that was hidden by illusion magic, just like hers. As they drew in closer, the stench was unbearable, almost as though it was herpes that killed Lydia. She was even surprised that they successfully passed through a large number of undead and felt they were joking when they said that they had regained the consciousness of the knights. What surprised her the most was seeing an undead who seemed to recognize her, but she had never created anyone looking like that. She was yet to recognize that this was Damort. So Damort cast the Castle of Hellfire spell around Lydia to remind her of the only one who could wield such powerful ancient magic. Medea put out the flames, using a spell known as the Roar of the Water Dragon, and then she instantly realized who she had been talking to all along. She felt Damort was so desperate to stop her from becoming famous that the lady even transformed into an undead. But Damort said Lydia would have been more successful if she had even one working brain cell. In any case, Lydia summoned a spell known as Eternal Darkness, and when Damort did the same, she realized that Lydia had indeed improved her skills greatly. In the middle of the brawl, Patra walked over to Lydia and smacked her cheeks with her staff, making her lose control and fall to the ground. This happened because Patra was so angry. After all, she almost died thanks to this lady. Lydia moved to create numerous illusion shadows that would deceive everyone and prevent them from knowing which version of herself was real, but Patra still got her a second time. It was easy since Lydia had a body odor so intense that it was easy to tell her apart from her clones, and Patra was more upset about the fact that if she had died, Locke would be unhappy. Damort stepped in and asked to be allowed to deal with her apprentice, and she said it was time to put an end to everything because both ladies had lived too long. Surprisingly, Damort summoned holy magic and made it obvious that she was willing to end her life, as well as Lydia, because no undead could survive holy magic. Before Lala could stop her, Damort had already started casting the spell. However, Locke beat her to it and blasted the holy magic right through Lydia's heart, and told Damort that she didn't have to disappear for a fool like Lydia. Every time, Lydia gradually vanished into thin air, and Damort realized that it wasn't even Lydia's body and her sacrifice would have been a waste. Lala hugged Damort and said she was glad she didn't disappear, but Damort told her that disappearance was imminent anyway because there were no magic students left, and she couldn't use stolen magic stones. Out of the blue, Locke suggested Damort become his familiar so she could use as many magic stores as she needed and reminded her that she still had a score to settle with Lydia. Don't wonder why he was okay making someone for a darkness, such as herself, into one of his familiars, while he reminded her that he was a user of holy magic, which might hurt her and cause her to disappear at some point. For Donnie, as long as this allowed her to keep living her life, she accepted it. After she befriended him, the system greatly weakened her magic since she was from a dark race. For befriending a new familiar, Locke was permitted to expand his master garden, so he chose to add a small sea. He wondered what was going to happen to Lala, but since the pixie was already Damort's familiar, she automatically became Locke's familiar. Locke later returned to the guild to present his report, only to find Marcus and Titus beefing with each other like side chicks. Has Lydia been defeated for good, or is she going to resurface even stronger? If you'd like to find out in part 2, type "clapping ant girls" in the comment section. If you enjoyed this video, give a thumbs up and subscribe for similar content. As always, thanks for watching and see you in the next video.